Hamatakapi. This is Nick Estes, host of the Red Nation Podcast, coming through to you today on a Friday, the end of the week. And today I wanted to just briefly talk about a couple of things that have been on my mind, specifically this question of manifest destiny. It's come up in the news several times recently. It's been invoked by the Trump administration as the sort of doctrine that is guiding his domestic and possibly foreign and stellar policy as it relates to the homeland that it calls the United States, the world that it calls its backyard, and now space. But before I start, I wanted to just share a couple of clips from the Trump administration. This one just came out today, August 8th. It's a clip from Bethany Stevens, who is the NASA spokesperson. I'll share this clip here.
Hi, I'm Bethany Stevens, NASA press secretary. Today, I'm on site at headquarters for this week's NASA Minute. NASA is fired up and ready to launch as we pursue our manifest destiny into the stars, guided by President Trump's vision for American space leadership.
Okay, first of all, this is a very strange video. I don't know who does the lighting at NASA, but this is it was said in one of my group chats where this was posted. This looks like a Stanley Kubrick film. It's very surreal. I mean, the Trump administration has been very bizarre in its sort of media portrayal of itself. I mean, the other day, Trump was on top of the White House, just inspecting things. He recently also received a gold bar from Tim Cook, the CEO of Apple. But yeah, this is a very strange sort of kind of surreal Trump moment. I'm going to play the rest of the video, but I just wanted to stop and pause and just talk about the aesthetics of what the Trump administration is. It's like, I think people online call it the enshittification of the internet. I think we could call it the enshittification of empire. It's not to say that empire was somehow, a golden sort of pristine project to begin with, but I think with Trump, it's sort of this veneer, this aesthetic veneer has been removed. I don't know if anyone has ever if you've ever had a Tupperware container brand new and you stored like spaghetti in it, and then you try to wash it and then it's like this red stain. That's literally the color of Trump's skin, but it's also a metaphor for the enshittification of the United States. It's permanently stained by the Trump administration. I'm going to continue this clip before I go into other bad metaphors.
This week, Secretary Duffy unveiled 2 policy directives about fission surface power on the lunar surface and commercial LEO destinations that take steps to ensure America is prepared to win the second space race. NASA's Space Technology Mission Directorate announced a new opportunity for U.S. companies to collaborate with NASA. Through this opportunity, companies will leverage NASA expertise, facilities, and software to advance commercial technologies in order to get us back to the moon and then on to Mars. Last week, Crew 11 launched from Kennedy Space Center for a science expedition aboard the ISS, and we're preparing to welcome Crew 10 back to Earth after 5 months in orbit. NASA's aeronautics leaders met with industry leaders to share the agency's vision for the future of flight, including using advanced air mobility research to increase transportation options for people and goods at a recent policy forum. The NASA Indian Space Research Organization, NISAR satellite, launched last week, delivering a new way to monitor Earth's surface in incredible detail. From returning Americans to the moon to planting the stars and stripes on Mars, NASA's turning bold ambitions into reality under President Trump. Follow along here and across NASA's social media channels to stay up to date as we make history together.
So that's a very for those who are listening to this podcast, I'll kind of just describe what the visuals of this. So it was the spokesperson for NASA speaking. She like in front of an American and NASA flag, and then there's these clips juxtaposed in a sort of a collage or montage style of rocket ships flying through the air, but then also a really bad CGI rendition of drones and things kind of like, a lot of like technology stuff. It's very flashy, right? It almost reminds me of Trump in the Oval Office and his large billboards or his large boards of graphs that he always has. I mean, he fired his last Bureau of Labor secretary Bureau of Labor Statistics person because essentially the graphs that this person had come up with didn't match what his reality or his vision of stuff. And so there's just a lot of this kind of like pomp and circumstance around this kind of particular video, and it's almost like an ad. It's like a really bad ad. I think Grok, the AI generator for X, Elon Musk's platform, could actually produce a better video, and probably has for SpaceX. But the point here is to really kind of home in on this notion of manifest destiny and how it's really permeated all aspects of American society, American politics, American culture, to the point that I think Trump's notion of "Make America Great Again," it's an attempt to recuperate what previous administrations, even the Biden administration, would rather have left unsaid, in terms of like the idea of a manifest destiny, or the United States as it currently exists as an expanding empire, an empire that is built by the frontier, that is literally created through this binary of savagery versus civilization. That sort of goes unsaid a lot of the times in the United States. And I actually appreciate the Trump administration for being more explicit about owning the sort of genocidal and expansionist and imperialist impulses of American ideology, because I think previous administrations, if you just look at the Biden administration, maybe it wasn't as belligerent in terms of expressing this ideology, but was no less dangerous. We have to remember, the Palestinian genocide happened or began as we know it today in its current iteration in the war and the famine, the imposed famine conditions on Gaza during the Biden administration. So I think Trump is more of an honest character. He lets the mask slip, or he just destroys the mask of empire. In this context, I want to bring up another sort of clip of Trump talking about manifest destiny in space, and then I'll jump into another sort of analysis here real quickly. Let me share my screen.
The United States will once again consider itself a growing nation, one that increases our wealth, expands our territory, builds our cities, raises our expectations, and carries our flag into new and beautiful horizons. And we will pursue our manifest destiny into the stars, launching American astronauts to plant the stars and stripes on the planet Mars. Ambition is the lifeblood of a great nation. And right now, our nation is more ambitious than any other. There's no nation like our nation.
This clip is a blast from the past. It's a State of the Union address from Trump's first administration. It's kind of funny to watch this because behind him you see Mike Pence and Nancy Pelosi. Nancy Pelosi is wearing white, and as the camera zooms out, after Trump says, manifest destiny in the stars, and we're going to plant our flag on Mars. I think he's trying to, be poetic in this moment, but you can see there's a standing ovation amongst Republican Congress people, and then on the other side of the aisle, there's people, I guess. Women Congress people on the Democratic side wearing white. And this really just kind of speaks to the inanity and the asinine nature of Democrats when faced with an overt sort of form of fascism. They do this symbolic protest. We're going to wear white. That's really going to show them. But also it's just funny because it's at every moment, at every turn, Democrats have capitulated to the Trump agenda. I think the difference here, the one sort of unifying factor here is not so much the differences that they have around manifest destiny, because, Netanyahu was in that same hall, the same, giving at that lectern, giving a speech to both houses of Congress, and got more standing ovations from both sides of the aisle than either president, either, Biden, Trump, or Obama. So we can see that this kind of facade of resistance, this facade of bipartisanship, this facade of, moral clarity and moral high ground really kind of melts in the face of what the empire actually does. And Trump, in this sense, is saying, the United States is forged through its relationship with the frontier. We may think of that as, what Alex Aviña has said on this show in the last episode, looking at the U.S.-Mexico border and the sort of productive nature of not just the U.S. security state, and the formation and the creation of institutions like Immigration Customs Enforcement, or ICE, as a colonial police force, but also how that sort of border, or this notion of Mexico or the United States and the rest of the world, also is a regime of hierarchy in terms of, let's cheapen labor in the South. Let's cheapen labor in these areas that are subordinated to U.S. power and hegemony and the economy, so that we can drive wages down, so that the United States can continue to extract, whether it's surplus labor, whether it's the value that's produced, whether it's resources, right? Whether it's the precarity of that labor when it crosses borders. That's what this regime of the frontier is really about in the 21st century. When we talk about it, so when we say manifest destiny, it's not a hearkening back to America, make America great again, because I think it's also just fascinating too that the fascist and the reactionary always returns back to this kind of imagined past, the imagined past of the frontier. When women were in the kitchen, and men were out there making a living, hacking their way through the wilderness, killing Indians, right? As if that was, even for the settlers, the white settlers and the colonizers, as if that was a good lifestyle, right? There's this imagining that, once we return back to that, we can really fulfill our destiny as a settler nation. And my argument would be like, well, the United States has never deviated from that project. And in fact, its export of the manifest destiny sort of ideology goes to other parts of the world. And so if we look at sort of parallels between what is happening in Palestine and the United States, or North America, Turtle Island, on one hand, we have the political, social, religious ideology of Zionism, that the exiles, this sort of notion of a exiled nation or nationality of Jewish people exiled from Europe, essentially, deserve a whole homeland based on some sort of biblical text, at the expense of the indigenous native inhabitants and peoples of what is now, what we know as Palestine, are standing in the way, right? That is really a corollary to this notion of manifest destiny. And while Zionism invokes a certain sort of character, I think what's also fascinating is that even we think of manifest destiny as something that's perhaps a little bit more aligned with a sort of right-wing mentality or more reactionary mentality. In fact, I think it's the governing ideology of what we know as the settler colonial state of the United States, because there is no nationality of America without the creation, the fabrication of the state. There is no nationality of whiteness, right, as a nation without the creation of Europe and the exporting of that project to other people's lands, and in this case, the Western Hemisphere, to create artificial nations such as the United States. So yeah, you do have to have a manifest destiny, right? You do have to have this belief and the inherent right of these nation states to exist in and of themselves. Before, not because of sort of the consensus of the people that live here, right? Native people didn't necessarily consent to the creation of the United States, and in fact, Manifest Destiny was constructed as an ideology to justify the genocide of indigenous nations, much in the same way that Zionism, we think of Zionism as this kind of like political yearning for Jewish homeland and freedom, but in fact, that's never. If you read like books like this I have sitting behind me, Ghassan Ghanafani's on Zionist literature, it is very clear from the beginning that the notion of a Zionist project, even predating the modern political movement of Zionism in the late 19th century, that this project, required a feat of imagination to construct in the primarily, and if not only, in the minds of the West, that Jewish people deserved a homeland in Palestine, right? That there was this place that existed, and that would require the removal, the expulsion, if not the elimination of the original inhabitants. That is the same thing that you see in the context of the United States. We actually have, if we want to take an originalist argument to the Constitution and the founding of the United States, Manifest Destiny is literally baked right into the cake from the very first document that's produced by the United States, which is the Declaration of Independence. When if you read the Declaration of Independence as a literary text, it is is an oratory, sort of polemical, right? That crescendos. It begins with these sort of broad ideals of what human society, or this idea of a universal society should strive for, the ideas of liberty, the ideas of democracy, in defense against tyranny, right? And that tyranny aspect is really important, because what are the complaints? What are the sort of obstacles to achieving those higher ideals for this white nation, this white settler nation that's building itself and defining itself, not against Europe necessarily, even though it's sort of emancipating itself from its parent, European nation, Great Britain, because it's also allying with the French at the time. It's not against Europe. I think this whole idea that somehow the American project is against Europe is completely misconstrued. It wasn't an anti-colonial project. It was fundamentally a colonial aspiration, because the 23rd complaint, after it names, all these things like quartering, soldiers, the British soldiers, there was all sort of silly complaints. The final one is that the British Crown had stirred up rebellions of indigenous people on the western frontier, and this is the language that the Thomas Jefferson is using in this document to talk about what he calls the merciless Indian savages. That's a direct quote from the Declaration of Independence. That's the characterization that this is actually not just about these high, lofty ideals of, the world just needs democracy, right? And this is the first democracy that was created in the United, in world history, or in modern world history. It was actually defining itself against people. It was saying, we are bringing civilization to a dark land. That's from the very inception. It's very unequivocal about what this nation is about, right? I would say that's the first instantiation of Manifest Destiny in what becomes the United States. Obviously, there's origins that precede it in terms of the ideas promoted by the sort of Puritans and specifically the Anglo settler colonial project that was well underway before the Declaration of Independence was signed. So I want to turn to another sort of image, and this is kind of this is a really absurd one too. I mean, they all are absurd, but you can see the Department of Homeland Security posted on, July 23rd, a heritage to be proud of, a homeland worth defending, American Progress by John Gast. This is a very quintessential painting. And one thing that I think is very interesting about this post, I was reading it and I was like, it's this sort of a cadence of this post, if you read it out loud, is very weird. A heritage to be proud of, comma, a homeland worth defending, American Progress, John Gast. It seems truncated a little bit, but then when you count out the words, it actually comes up to 14 words. If anyone knows the sort of origins or the symbolism of the 14 words, it's a white supremacist saying. It's something like, let me look it up actually, because I can't actually remember what 14 words stands for. I'll read it here. The 14 words is a reference to two slogans that, this is according to Wikipedia, apologies for using this, but it's a reference to a slogan that says, "We must secure the existence of our people and the future for white children." And then there's a second part to that, which is because the beauty of the white Aryan woman must not perish from the earth. So there's the first part, which is the 14 words. We must secure the existence of our people and a future for white children. The second part is because the beauty of the white Aryan woman must not perish from the earth. I think this painting very much encapsulates this aspiration. And I don't think you kind of need to be a raging sort of, caricature of a neo-Nazi or a white supremacist to see how naturalized this notion of Western progress is to, highly racialized and gendered forms of white supremacy. You can see here too, it's like you have on the left-hand side, for those of you who are listening, I'll just describe the picture. It's an oil painting. I think it was painted in 1873. On the left-hand side is a sort of a dark frame, right? You have native people who are on horseback. You have bears. You have what look like a coyote, a herd of buffalo, all fleeing, right, to the left of frame. And there's sort of like ominous storm clouds in the background. In the middle, you have what is ostensibly Lady Liberty, who is lily white and has a star atop her head. She's blonde. She's kind of robed in this flowing sort of robe. And in her right hand, she's holding, let's see, what does that actually say? She's holding a book that says school book. I don't know how many of you all had a book that was literally labeled school book, but obviously it's like education. And in her left hand, she's stringing along what could be seen as like possibly a telegraph post. And then she's followed by stagecoaches. There's a train. You can see on the far right-hand corner, which possibly is the east, represents the east. So the west is bad. It's the savage sort of frontier, the merciless Indian savages who are making way for the great American empire. And in the right-hand side, you see the sun that's rising in the east, bringing light to the land. And as it spreads its light, it casts out the darkness. And with it, you have men who are on plow, sitting behind plows, being pulled by oxen. You have people working, right? And then, of course, chasing away these native people who don't have the same sort of civilizational standards. Obviously, American Progress, this painting by John Gast, has been interpreted as a sort of representation of the concept of manifest destiny, the idea that God had destined the people of the United States to come here to spread democracy, right, to the rest, to at least the North American continent. Other theorists, even Thomas Jefferson himself, imagined an empire of liberty of the entire Western Hemisphere, which would extend to South America. You also have things like the Monroe Doctrine that said that kind of posited the United States as the only European power that had authority within the Western Hemisphere. We see how that plays out today in terms of the United States believing that it has sort of the authority or the right to intervene in affairs of other countries in Latin America. And we can see this with, the current sort of sanction regimes against recalcitrant nations who are carving their own path of sovereignty, such as Nicaragua, Venezuela, Cuba, who are also, moving towards socialism. And I think there's also a conflation here that doesn't go acknowledged as well. Like even at the turn of the century, the turn of the 19th century to the 20th, you also had a large influx of Eastern European immigrants, who many of whom were the survivors of the wars in Europe, the sort of communards, right, who were being expelled from Europe, from Eastern Europe, being sent to the United States, and began to clamor for workers' rights here, and began to form sort of the nascent forms of communism in the United States. And what's also fascinating at this particular moment in time in 1873, you have this kind of notion of a threat that this communist menace that was once coming from Europe is now coming to the United States. But it was conflated. It was also very much coded in the language of savagery and civilization, that native people at this particular moment in time began to be defined as essentially communist. And you can see this in the records of the civilization regulations that came out at the late 19th century that were talking about the destruction of the tribe, the taking away of children, sending them off to boarding schools for the purposes of destroying tribal life, which were seen as communistic, right? The idea that native people, communism itself was a form of savagery. Even its modern iteration in Europe, under the likes of Karl Marx, and the Paris Commune, the various sort of revolutions or attempts at revolution in Europe. Eventually, that leads to the Russian Revolution in 1905 and then 1917. But there's this sort of growing sort of like Red Scare, right? And the conflation of communism as a political ideology, a movement of workers, as being inherently savage, much like the native people. So I think in this particular moment of manifest destiny, as it's depicted in John Gast painting, is also the idea, the sort of racialized and politicized idea of a capitalist nation, right? Of this, it's very much idealized in this this photograph or this painting of these small sort of producers. Everyone gets a plot of land. There are no labor conflicts, right? You see whatever sort of tensions are in the city, the pressure valve is opened in the West, right? By opening up this land. The only problem is he's got to kill these primitive communists, these savage communists who are on the Western frontier. So I think you see this sort of conflation. Obviously, this is also applied to Black folks in the South during the time of Reconstruction, as well as they become more sort of radicalized and integrated in creating their own sort of workers unions and tenant organizing, tenant farmer organizing in the South to oppose the sort of reestablishment of capital in the South as well. So I think this notion of manifest destiny is inherently anti-Indian. It's inherently settler colonial. It's also inherently anti-communist. And I think we see a lot of sort of sympathies expressed as saying like, this is a racist depiction of whatever. But I think we actually have to look at that. It's not just like targeting native people, because native people were like savages and they spoke different languages. They were like, they dressed funny. They didn't want to become farmers. No, the intention was to take the land. That was the first and primary intention. The second one was to prevent and to destroy any kind of political alternative that they might provide in terms of exerting their own sort of sovereignty in North America, and I guess the Western Hemisphere in general, but specifically in the context of what became the United States in North America. And we can see that today in the sort of iterations of the attack on Palestine by Zionism, by Zionist forces, is not necessarily because, they're just Muslims and this is a religious war and this is a civilizational war. Again, these two, Muslim civilizations versus, or Western civilization versus the Orient, right? This kind of whole battle, it's actually one about political alternatives and political realities in the region called West Asia. It's defined in these civilizational terms, much like Manifest Destiny is, but the real world sort of political economic implications to this, right? The United States has been using Israel as a military outpost to project its interests in the region, much like, it might seem silly to say, we're going to project, U.S. belligerence abroad by to the stars by a Manifest Destiny of the stars. But in reality, these are strategic military claims, as much as they are in space as they are, in this sort of terrestrial realm. But there's also the kind of the notion, as much of the text that I have read at this, that about U.S. involvement in the genocide and leadership within the genocide in the U.S. or in Gaza right now, you have military personnel and advisors and observers who are attached to IDF, IDF battalions who are observing what the IDF is doing in this particular region, the kind of war that it's waging, right? And looking at like how the IDF is justifying, its actions of genocide legally, to say that they're not actually actions of, they're not actually acts of genocide, that this is just how war was fought in the past. They're actually looking at like this notion of like kind of large scale warfare and combat as a sort of model, and not a sort of not what the United States has been doing for the last 20 years, supposedly been doing for the last 20 years with its war on terror model, where it's, targeted sort of drone strikes, small actions. The U.S. is very interested in what Zionist forces are doing in this particular region, because they're looking not only at their tactics, but also the sort of political geography of the region. It's the back door to China, right? It's Iran. Iran is just one step away from China, and so they're looking at like not only curbing the influence of China in that region, but also modeling out what a large scale war or conflict with China might look like, and the immense amount of civilian casualties that would entail on the part of the Chinese if the United States decided to attack Taiwan. These are the military documents that they're thinking. So this notion of Manifest Destiny isn't just confined to what the United States views as the homeland, right? This ideology is permeated. You can't really take apart domestic and foreign policy in this context. I think there is a critical dialectic between the two, but nonetheless, they're kind of formed by the same sort of settler, colonial, imperialist ideology, very much so encapsulated within the sort of immigration customs enforcement apparatus, which I think Trump now is looking to see. He didn't do this in his first administration, but he's doing it in this one. He's kind of looking at like where he can build up his federal police force, right? Now ICE has surpassed the FBI in terms of its funding as a federal policing agency. I think we're at this kind of critical moment of like, we can't go back, right? Because I think even Obama, he came in like saying he was going to kind of undo these institutions that were created, under the sort of war on terror, the idea of the auspices of the war on terror. And the war on terror was a totally, kind of like external, or, we got to fight the external enemy, but it actually turned internal, because that's where, again, you can't separate the kind of foreign and domestic in this context. But Obama had this chance, right? He campaigned on it, that he was going to really dismantle these oppressive apparatuses of the state. But in fact, he expanded them in terms of his deportation. You can look at Alex Vina and I's conversation about this. But then, Trump, I don't think really fully took advantage of ICE in terms of his or Department of Homeland Security. And this is something that I've been arguing for quite some time, and I don't think people have really paid attention to it. But leading up to her nomination as the Secretary of Department of Homeland Security, Kristi Noem took several strategic measures to begin her sort of like, I guess, audition, right, for this role. One of them was, her threats against tribal nations within the state of South Dakota. This was long standing in her kind of term as governor of the state before she took the cabinet level position in Trump's administration. But she threatened to deploy the National Guard against reservation communities who had set up road checkpoints during the COVID-19 pandemic to protect. There were health checkpoints, so you weren't actually turned away in some instances. Some tribes did at some moments in time, but it was more of a health checkpoint to say, do you have any symptoms? It was to protect their communities because tribes have jurisdiction over their own homelands. The state of South Dakota does not have authority or jurisdiction on tribal land. So she threatened to send the National Guard to take these checkpoints down because, it was just this very belligerent attitude towards anything that was like science-based in terms of stopping the spread of COVID-19. That created a lot of antagonisms. Several of the tribes issued banishment resolutions to banish Kristi Noem from the reservation lands. By the time she left office and took her position at Department of Homeland Security, she had been effectively banned from all 9 reservations in the state, including my reservation, the Lower Brule Sioux tribe. But this had to do, those final banishments coming from our tribes had to do with her position on what she called Mexican cartels that had infiltrated the reservations. She made she gave this kind of speech saying, it was a state of the state address. She gave this speech kind of saying that the state of South Dakota had its own borders, open borders, and it was coming from Indian reservations. This large influx of fentanyl was being imported into Indian reservations by Mexican cartels that were then exporting it to the non-native population, the white population of South Dakota, and getting them hooked on opioids. To also kind of further her credentials as somebody who's going to be, tough on Mexican illegals, as she would call them. She sent the South Dakota National Guard down to the Texas border with Mexico. She took money, I think it was like $1 million or something like that, perhaps even more, a donation from a billionaire to do this, right? To basically have a billionaire pay the National Guard to go beat up Mexican migrants and migrants coming from Central America. That was her mentality. That's what she thought was a good use of her time as governor of South Dakota. But also she was almost kind of like an imperial governor in the sense that she saw her role as extending beyond the confines of her state and extending that sovereignty, to a sort of a federal and national or international level to say we also it's under our jurisdiction and authority to also police, other people from other nations, including Native people. So in many sense, she created a laboratory of repression in South Dakota that I think was really her audition for the national stage when she came into the Department of Homeland Security. And now we can really see the kind of true colors of the Department of Homeland Security on full display with, this posting of this white nationalist, white supremacist, ideology of confirming, manifest destiny. And what better person to put in that role and that leadership role than Kristi Noem herself, who made a career, as many South Dakota politicians have, off of Indian hating and using Native people as a sort of a punching bag to advance their own political careers and aspirations to a national level. I think this goes back to people like Bill Janklow, who was the Attorney General during the Red Power movement and the AIM takeovers of Wounded Knee in 1973. And he, basically said the best way to solve the problem, the native problem in the state of South Dakota is to put a gun to every AIM member's head and pull the trigger. This is a direct quote from him, or that he said on national or on local television. He didn't say it on national television. That really bolstered his chances of his political chances. He became governor as a result. He later served at the U.S. congressional level. He died in infamy, though, because he was a notorious speeder and drug user and ended up murdering and killing a biker because he drove through a stop sign. And so that kind of ended his political career. But nonetheless, he's kind of set the sort of stage of successive politicians from South Dakota, including Kristi Noem, who kind of build their political careers on Indian hating. And I think that gets that kind of, these images of Kristi Noem down in El Salvador at these detention facilities, kind of sitting in front of, these men who are detained and behind bars, and I think she was wearing like a Rolex watch and all these things. This was the reality for many American Indians in the state of South Dakota, Lakota, Dakota people, my people, during her tenure as governor. And we were warning the rest of the nation, that this is she has national, aspirations. So this notion of manifest destiny, as we kind of like understand it today, is very much grounded in the politics of Indian hating. We can kind of see the results and the fruits of this labor in the way that people like Kristi Noem sort of prime the pumps, so to speak, when it comes to creating an enemy. And I think the other part of it, though, is that her successes as somebody who is advancing manifest destiny in the Trump regime or the Trump administration, her successes in her political career can be attributed to the strength of Native nations. Why did we pose such a threat, for putting up these health checkpoints, that she needed to deploy the National Guard? Well, one of the reasons is because tribes American Indians had some of the highest rates of vaccination, meaning that we advocated our tribal nations, those in the Indian Health Service, which hasn't had the greatest record. I'll be the first to say that hasn't had the greatest record in terms of service, advocated to get vaccines into the hands of American Indians. In some places, there was a 95% vaccination rate. There were so many vaccines, and they were so good at getting these vaccines out and into tribal communities that there was a surplus, and they were inviting non-Native people onto the reservation to get vaccinated, right? This posed a direct threat to the authority of Kristi Noem, who denied, was a COVID denialist, denied COVID-19 was a bad thing. And you saw these mass die-offs of mostly white elderly in the state of South Dakota, including her own mom. Her own mother died in an elderly home at the age of 90. It's debatable about whether that was due to COVID-19 or not, but nonetheless, there were, a mass killing or culling of white people. So if, Native people have some sort of like vaccine diplomacy in terms of like making good relations with sometimes hostile, white neighbors, that directly threatens the sort of the authority of her assessment in terms of like whether COVID-19 is a real thing. I think her mentality was that, how dare the tribes do this, right? And so what are the consequences of that? Well, one, we can see there's been massive budget cuts by the Trump administration, not just to national kind of health services, but also to IHS, to Indian Health Services, the Bureau of Indian Affairs, the Bureau of Indian Education. We've seen tribal colleges and universities get their funding cut. I think a lot of tribal leaders leading up to the Trump administration, him taking power, kind of understood that the writing was on the wall. They also, there wasn't a lot of pushback also against U.S. foreign policy and expanding its sort of settler colonial wars, its Indian wars here to Palestinians. I think a lot of tribal leaders wanted to play it safe. Some didn't. The Red Lake Nation issued this really beautiful statement condemning the United States role in Palestinian genocide. A lot of Native people stood up, but a lot of tribal organizations at a national level refused to say anything about it. I think out of fear that they would ostracize themselves from the Trump administration. So what happened? What happened when you capitulate to a manifest destiny ideology? Well, it still came around and killed you. It still came around and killed you, like much like the United States has done with every sort of vassal state, right? Whether it's Saddam Hussein, who the United States backed against against Iran back in the 80s, it came back for him. Even though like somebody like, I'm trying to think of other ones that are good examples of that. Who knows? Giuliani in Syria, maybe his days are numbered. I think the HTS kind of U.S.-backed, Turkey-backed government of Syria that's now, that ousted Assad is also a good example, because what happened immediately after they won their independence, from the Assad government, Israel bombed them, is continuing to bomb them. They've invaded them, their national sovereignty, even though, Giuliani went up and said, Israel's not our enemy. They still went in and they created, so even this notion, if you side with the colonizer, that somehow maybe you'll be spared the boot or the noose or the sword or whatever, however you want to say it. Actually, I think it increases your chances, because they know that you are essentially a running dog of empire that can be put down, just like Saddam Hussein was. So we are in this moment right now domestically where a lot of tribal leaders and organizations have capitulated with the Trump regime. And what are the consequences of that? Did that get us more funding? No, it actually got our sort of critical funding, whether it's through education, whether it's through healthcare, housing, even I think daycare services have been threatened. We get those things removed from us, right? Those treaty guaranteed responsibilities are removed and actually defunded because of that capitulation, not in spite of it, but because of that capitulation. And so I think the model that we really need to move towards, and I'm going to pull up one last thing, and this is an article that I want to share. It was recently published in Al-Akbar, which is a resistance magazine. And there's this quote in here. It's a great assessment. I'll post it in the show notes. There's this great assessment of like what happened to, Palestinian resistance and the axis of resistance and Arab resistance in the region, when are in the aftermath of October 7th and leading, into the sort of the widespread famine that's happening in Gaza, where you were seeing this horrific, pictures of malnourished children, all different kinds of people getting massacred and slaughtered at aid distribution sites. It's absolutely horrific. This is the most documented genocide in history, the scale of which has never, I think won't be understood. I think the repercussions and the echoes of it are like resounding, even in my own profession, as Trump goes around and bullies. I don't even know if it's bully is the right word, because maybe they always wanted to do this. I don't know. These Ivy League institutions to pay out, Jewish students who ostensibly experience forms of anti-Semitism, at their universities, but not even, to completely silence any sort of notion that like Palestinians are undergoing a genocide and and those who are against that genocide are actually facing active repression. To say nothing of the centuries-long genocide against Native people, for which many of these universities have profited, if not all of them, whether they're state or private funded. I mean, my own university has implemented mandatory anti-Semitism training starting this fall, but has not responded to a report that shows through numbers and a ledger how much the university has actually profited from the genocide of my people, of Dakota and Lakota people, of people who were exiled from this territory. But yet we don't undergo mandatory anti-Indian training, or racist training, or whatever it was. I don't know what it would be. There's also an attempt to put funding for our programs and Native students within the category of what Trump has now identified as race-based categories or race-based admissions, completely undermining the notion that this federal money that was guaranteed for higher education for Native students is not based on race. It's actually based on political and legal status as American Indian people. We are a people, not individuals or an individual race or minority. So I think there's a lot of effects that are happening, or reverberating effects that are happening because of the genocide, that are really hard to address for a lot of folks. Because if you don't have an anti-imperialist analysis, if you don't have an anti-Zionist and anti-genocide analysis, your politics and your pushback against this particular moment in time are not going to amount to much. So in sort of closing, I want to share this last sort of article. It's an article that was published on August 7th. It's called Palestinian Peoples on Disintegration and the Conditions for Intifada by Moussa al-Sadah. And it came out August 7th of this year. And there's this quote that I want to read here. And the author is really talking about, why is it that the West Bank hasn't risen up in the way that it has during the past intifadas, the first intifada, the second intifada. They weren't just spontaneous. While there was a spontaneous element to those uprisings, they also birthed organizations, resistance organizations. So like, for example, the first intifada created, or out of the first intifada came, the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, as well as Hamas, right? So you have these armed resistance movements coming out of the first intifada. Where is that sort of same, organizational sort of response to this particular genocide? That's the kind of question this author is asking. And so in this quote, he writes, outside Palestine, the discourse of the axis of resistance and the media machinery that props it up have created a public that no longer imitates or organizes. It watches and waits. It cheers. It posts. It mistakes performance for participation. The more intensely one signals loyalty to the digital realm, the more one believes they are part of the struggle, while the hard work of organizing, mobilizing, and sacrificing on the ground is avoided and deferred. This post is really, this essay is really fascinating, because I think it also speaks to the moment that we're in as American Indian people in this particular moment. Whereas, previous generations, whether it was the termination era, bred armed resistance, such as the Red Power movement and the American Indian movement. This moment, has bred like the water protector movement against, fossil fuel extraction and expansion, with obviously different tactics, but we don't see the sort of sustained organizing, right? Theory is one thing, practice is another. The confluence of both is an organization, right? something that goes beyond just spontaneous uprising on one hand, but is theorizing what change might have to look like in the immediate term, but also what it might look like in the long term. And in this particular moment, as a lot of us are, sit paralyzed, almost helpless in front of our phones every morning as we watch this genocide unfold, and this world historical moment, pass by us. Are we active participants? Are we active agents in our own destiny? Right? Because this manifest destiny is living out its ideals, it's living out its sort of machinations of power, but are we living out ours, and the ones that are guaranteed to us as not just American Indian people, but people of conscience, people who believe fundamentally in humanity, who believe in peace and justice. We can't have the first without the former. First, we can have peace when there is justice, and I think in this moment in time, we're really confronted with not just pointing out the problems, because we have plenty of evidence, we have plenty of facts about the problems. It's about what we do, how we organize strategically to actually affect this particular change that's needed to stop this genocide. We see more and more people from the West participating in direct action, whether it's getting on a flotilla to try to break the blockade on Palestine. I don't know, what are the sort of political channels we have in terms of electoral politics when both parties are captured by this imperialist agenda. It's not just Zionism, because once you start going down the path of like, let's get somebody in power, if it's not being pro-Zionist and genocidal, then it's going to be anti-China, anti-communist rhetoric, and anti-poor rhetoric. So I think in this moment we need to envision what that sort of organization is going to look like. It's kind of almost cliche to say that you have to join an organization to partake in the struggle, but no other moment in time demands it more. I don't know if we will be. I'm pessimistic in the sense that we might be too late in stopping the worst effects, the most deleterious effects of this genocide. But we still have to organize. We still have to envision something that's beyond the realm of the symbolic and signaling that we're on one side or the other. This is a moment of crisis, and I think as I've always considered when I read books about the history of our people in these moments of terrible danger, in the 19th century when the Indian Wars were in full swing. How do they want to be remembered by their descendants? And I think, for us, how are we going to become those ancestors who made those decisions, who said, at this moment in time, I didn't sit by because I felt like, Big Daddy Trump was going to dole out all the resources that we need as Native people, as Native nations, because to me, that notion of begging is actually very undignified and self-dehumanizing. But how are we going to actually take what's ours, and not for just ourselves, but for everyone? I think we are beyond this. We're beyond the pale, or beyond the sort of precipice of really going back to normal in this country, or a status quo. Because what is the status quo? What has the status quo been my entire life? I think half of my life has been defined by forever wars. Actually, almost more than half of my life has been defined by forever wars. All I've known since I was a child is that this country has been at war with people, has been committing genocide. These are not, if you're going to go the electoral path, or you're going to go the path of politics, if you're going to go down the same road that has been traveled, if you're going to sheepdog people back into the hands of the very parties that have led us to this moment in time where there is essentially no future other than one of destruction, then you're not really offering anything different. And I think we need bravery and courage more than anything in this moment in time. We need less of this analysis of why things are bad, and more of how are we going to change it? What commitments are we going to make? Because our ancestors are watching us, and those future generations are going to look back and judge very, very harshly about what we did and what we didn't do in this particular moment in time. I think, that's all I have for right now. I know this kind of went off the rails a little bit on Manifest Destiny. There's much more to say about this. I didn't even get into some of the other clips that I wanted to show, but I think it's important to understand that as we try to defeat this, this cancer of Zionism, as it's taking its literal pound of flesh from Palestinians, that we also look closer to home and understand that Zionism is only possible with Manifest Destiny. If the United States did not support Israel, did not help Israel in this genocide and its attacks on places like Iran and elsewhere, there wouldn't be this genocide. There wouldn't be the kind of destruction and suffering that we're seeing today. So if we want to start somewhere, we can start by dismantling that ideology brick by brick.